Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome to the video. Welcome to my garage. In this video, we're going to be talking about sway bars. So when I'm explaining things like this, I like to put them into extremes, and I can't put them into extremes if the shock absorbers or the springs are still on here. So when I show you some of the effects of this sway bar, either on ratchet or on the RC car, bear in mind there would be other factors involved if your springs were on there or if your shock absorbers were on there. But either way, what I like to do is wrap my head around the extremes. And in knowing the extremes, when you put all the pieces together, you can kind of pick and choose and figure out what you need to tweak and what's helping you and what's not. So keep that in mind right now. These are going to be extremes because there's no springs and there's no shock absorbers. Typically, people think of a sway bar as a device that is meant to stabilize the suspension to the chassis. And to a certain extent, that makes sense because the sway bar is connected to the chassis. But really, what the sway bar is just a third spring in your suspension design. So in the design of Ratchet here, he's got a set of springs over here for this lower control arm, and he's got a set of springs over here for this lower control arm. Then you throw the sway bar in there, and a sway bar is a spring that connects that control arm with that control arm. And to be honest with you, the spring doesn't really care about the body stability. The only thing the spring wants to do is have that control arm equalized with that control arm. It's a spring that equalizes the two control arms. So it's a sway bar or it's an equalizer bar. Oftentimes I think of it as an equalizer bar because that is the only thing that it cares about. It doesn't want this control arm to be different than this control arm. It doesn't care if they're both compressed. It doesn't care if they're both drooped. It does not care about that if they're both the same. Actually, this is a good time for the RC car. Okay, so right now we're looking up the caboose of this RC car. And it does have a sway bar connected right here. This is where it's connected to the chassis. And then these two arms here, and then these little turnbuckles are where it connects with the suspension arms, okay? So just like on Ratchet, this right now has a sway bar on it. And again, I've taken the springs and the shock absorbers off just so that we can, watch how it works. So right now this is in full droop. The sway bar does not care. You can go to full compression. Sway bar does not care. You don't even feel the sway bar when you're doing this because the two control arms are in the same position, and that's all it wants to do. It wants those to be the same. However, I'm going to hold the chassis down a little bit here. If I raise one side, you see how the other side starts to come up. Now I'm not touching the other side, but the sway bar, which is just a spring, is drawing it up because this side is going up. And so the sway bar on this side, because it's a spring connecting the two, is pulling up on it because as soon as this starts to change, the sway bar wants them to be the same. So the sway bar kicks in when the control arms are unequal, but if they're equal, the sway bar does nothing. It doesn't care. So what happens is, now notice I'm not holding the chassis down with my finger right now. When I pick this wheel up, it's tilting the chassis to the side. Why is that? It's because even though I have the springs removed, as I bring this side up, this stabilizer bar is fighting me because I'm making the lower control arms unequal. And so it has to transfer that through the chassis. So you know how we call stabilizer bar a stabilizer bar? Well, guess what? Right now, it's destabilizing the chassis. It's doing the opposite of what people think it does. It's actually making the chassis unstable. Because if we were barreling down a dirt road and we hit a big bump over here, it would destabilize the chassis. Now, I'm going to disconnect the sway bar and we'll see what happens then. Okay, now I've disconnected the sway bar. You can still, the sway bar is still there, but if you look, I disconnected the turnbuckle connecting it to this side. So now, as we're barreling down that dirt road, and this side hits a rock, it can go all the way up, and now it can travel completely independent of this side. So it can go all the way up. It's bumping the chassis there because it's maxing out. But if I go up before I bottom out here, it can go all the way up, and it does not affect the chassis whatsoever. So that's why I'm always careful with sway bars, because when you put them on, you'll gain some stability in corners and whatnot, but you know, on an off-road vehicle like this, how much cornering stability do you really need? I mean, typically when you're going around corners on dirt, you're going to be sliding anyways. But if you put a nice, heavy, beefy sway bar on like that, then as you hit certain bumps, you're going to lose some of your travel, and it's going to destabilize your body. So that's why I was kind of reluctant to put the sway bar on there. I know from experience that I'm not a huge fan of sway bars on off-road vehicles like this, but I did know that I wanted to at least have it in case I needed it. So that's why I added all this, but that's why in the future you might see me running a lot of times without it. But now let's talk about how the sway bar does actually help you in corners. Okay, so we're looking at the rear of the RC car again. I've got it up on some blocks, and the sway bar is reconnected. You can see there, if I pick this up all the way, it picks the other wheel up. Now we're going to look at where sway bars actually do help quite a bit. So now if you've got your vehicle, I guess this could be an on-road car or an off-road car at this point, and whatever surface you're on, it's giving you a lot of traction to the tires. So you start going into a turn, and those forces start making the vehicle twist. Now you notice what's happening here. As I lean the chassis over, it's picking this tire up. And that's because as I lean the car over, the control arms are at different heights. This is not at full compression. It's not at full compression. It's being picked up because as I lean it over, the sway bar, remember, does not want the two control arms to be at different position. It wants them to be equal. So as it leans, it picks this side up. And what does that do? Picking this side up will draw the car down. It will prevent the car from being able to keep leaning, you know, because it's not going to pick this tire up. So what would happen is, as you go through that turn, once you got to this point, the chassis would stop leaning. I mean, within reason, anything could happen. But as you were turning, as soon as this would start to rise, then the chassis would stop leaning. So in situations like that, the sway bar will help stabilize the body. I'm not saying it won't do that. What I'm pointing out is that it will hurt you if you have long travel and you're just trying to get independent suspension, because as soon as you put on your sway bar, remember the sway bar, all it wants to do is equalize, which is the opposite effect of independent suspension. It doesn't want those two control arms to move independently of each other. It doesn't want this. It wants this. It's perfectly happy with this. It does not want that. And if you're going down a dust road or whatever, and you've got different varying bumps, you know, your suspension's going to be doing this. And if you've got a sway bar on there, instead of being able to do this, the sway bar is going to make it do this. And all of that energy then is going to have to be absorbed either by the components of your suspension, or your chassis is going to have to, you know, absorb some of it. Whereas before, the chassis might stay still while the control arms do this. If the sway bar is strong enough and the control arms can only do this, then your chassis is going to have to pick up the rest of it. So the whole thing's a give and take, obviously. All suspension is a give and take. But that's something that you have to consider, because it will dramatically reduce your vehicle's ability to soak up big bumps if they're independent. If they're like whoops that affect both sides at the same time, that's not a problem, because you can go like this. The sway bar doesn't care about that. It just doesn't like this. So for fun, let me connect the sway bar on ratchet here. I'm going to put it at ride height. I'm going to connect the sway bar. I'm going to let one side just hang in midair. I'm going to crank up the other side, and you'll see the other side follows it up. It's pretty cool. Okay, now I've got the sway bar connected. There's no jack underneath this side right now. It's merely being held up by the sway bar. So this side still has the jack holding it up, but the other side is free floating. So watch what happens when I lower and raise this one. So when I did that, you could see that because of the sway bar, the two sides follow one another because the sway bar does not want the lower control arms to be different than one another. It wants them to be the same. Whether it's full droop, full compression, or anywhere in between, it's happy if they're the same. If they're different, it's fighting. Now obviously I'm doing this under no load, so depending on what the suspension is doing, it might be able to travel a lot by just resisting the sway bar, okay? So like I said, I'm showing you extremes, but the reason I'm doing that is so that you can understand what the sway bar does, how it helps you, and how it fights you. Right, buddy? Right on, man. Okay guys, that's it for this video. I just wanted to do a video before I got all sorts of things together here, and it would have been too much of a pain to take this all back apart. But I wanted to show you how my brain thinks of sway bars and what my idea was when I put this on here. I wanted to show you how the sway bars can help you, but how they can also hurt you quite a bit on a vehicle that has a decent amount of suspension. So thanks for watching the video. I hope it's helping you with whatever you might be working on, or maybe just entertaining you for a little while. I don't know. And I hope to see you on the next video. Take care.